Well, hello, friends. This is a little bit of a surprise because the recording device last Wednesday, when I was giving my lecturette on the second session of our Bible study together, it didn't work. And somewhere the videos are floating in the cloud, unretrievable. So here I am on Monday morning re-recording them with much gratitude to our technological expert, Tom Rose. So here we go, friends. Remember last week we looked at the Apostle Paul and talked about how he focused on the resurrection by primarily offering up various appearances of the Christ to disciples, to a large group, and finally to himself. But he never did mention the discovery of the empty tomb or what happened on that very first day on the Sunday morning. So now we turn to the gospel stories, which actually focus and primarily describe the encounter at the empty tomb on Sunday morning. We begin with the Gospel of Mark because, as I told you last week, it is the first of the gospel stories. It comes around the years 70-ish, give or take a few years. Matthew and Luke actually build on the Gospel of Mark. Chronologically, that becomes the backbone. And they are able to put their Gospels together with dependence on Mark, but they add a lot more material, primarily teaching material and various parables. So for instance, in Matthew, you have the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, you have the Sermon on the Plain. Mark only has 16 chapters, but Matthew moves it up to 28, and Luke moves it up to 24. So you can see that they've added an awful lot, but Mark is still the primary one, and it is the first description of what happened on that Sunday morning. Now, here is where we enter into a big problem as we look at chapter 16, the final chapter of Mark. And the very first problem is that chapter 16 is, well, perhaps 8 verses or perhaps 20 verses. If you look at your Bible, you will look and see after verse 8, a couple of verses that have snuck in called the shorter ending of Mark. And then if you look a little further down, you'll see the longer ending of Mark, verses 9 to 20. And you're left wondering which one was the real Mark. Did he really mean to finish the gospel at verse 8, or was it to continue on to verse 20? The first problem you want to look at is, even with 20 verses, it's not very much. And with 8, it's even less when you're trying to describe the foundational event of Christianity. If you were, for instance, to look at chapters 14 and 15, where Mark is describing the events of Thursday, and then the trial and the crucifixion on Friday, you have chapters that have 77 verses and 47 verses, meaning that he had 77 and 15, 147 verses to describe the death and only 8 to describe the actual resurrection, which always strikes me as weird. But I want to run you through the arguments that are put forward for determining that Mark's original intention was to end at verse 8. And I know it's probably not earth-shaking and it won't change your life, but it is some interesting detective work, biblical detective work, trying to determine what is the original. So the first thing you look at is the number of manuscripts that we have from those early centuries. And the very earliest, and the ones that scholars consider as the most authoritative, they all end at verse 8. And it isn't until somewhere later on into the 2nd century that you begin to see manuscripts that have the extra verses added. The second thing is you look at the number of church fathers, and they were fathers rather than mothers in those days. The church fathers, who were the scholars or the commentators on scripture and theology, they talk as if they're looking at Mark ending at verse 8, and they don't actually include any reference to those extra verses that seem to be added on. Thirdly, you use the whole question of logic. You need to ask yourself, does it make more sense for monks who were copying the manuscripts at a later date to take something away from the original because it was embarrassing, or whether they would in fact add something because that made the story less embarrassing? And frankly, when you look at this situation, it makes sense to me that a monk somewhere in the 2nd century would look at verse 8 and say you can't end by saying they told no one because they were very afraid. And the monk would choose to add some information about resurrection appearances. It doesn't make any sense that a monk at a later date would say, no, I'm going to cross out the resurrection appearances and just go with verse 8 where they were afraid and said nothing. That is problematic. Some people have wondered whether we're missing the longer ending of Mark because it was on a separate page and somehow got separated from the original manuscript. But that is almost impossible because that 16th chapter ends at the halfway point on a page, and so the rest would actually fit. There isn't some missing page that actually had all the rest of the gospel. Also, you can take a look, if you're an expert, and I'm not, I know no Greek whatsoever, not my language, but the experts say that the Gospel of Mark was written in what you might call down-to-earth Greek, the kind of language that people would use in everyday interchange. And the last verses from 9 to 20 are slightly more stylish, as if perhaps they were created by an educated monk who spoke Greek more fluently, perhaps, than Mark did. The other factor is that you can actually see when you read verses 9 to 20 the discrete and borrowing and the summarizing of various appearances that appear in other gospels. For instance, the verses 9 to 11 are a description of Mary Magdalene going to the garden and then running back to the disciples who do not believe. Verses 12 to 13 is a clear reference to the appearance of Christ on the road to Emmaus found in the Gospel of Luke. And verse 14 talks about an appearance of Jesus to the disciples as they're gathered in an upper room, which you would find in the Gospels of Luke and John. So it feels as if a monk at a later date is reading the other Gospels, borrowing some material, and attaching it to Mark. The final reason for people saying that it ends at verse 8 is you get some very weird stuff coming in at the end. In fact, they describe the apostles as therefore being given the gift of being able to handle poisonous snakes with no fear of injury, or they're able to drink poison, and that somehow becomes a test whether they're truly godly and truly called. You don't find any other references in the Bible to drinking poison or handling snake. Mind you, there is one short little story later on in the book of Acts when Paul is being transported from Jerusalem back to Rome for trial, and there's a shipwreck right near the island of Malta. Everybody gets off board, swims to shore, they build a fire in order to warm up. Paul is out trying to get some firewood, sticks his hand into some bushes, and gets bitten by a viper. Hauls his hand out, and this big viper is hanging from his hand, and all the locals say, that guy's going to die, and he doesn't. At which point the locals say, he's clearly a man of God. Maybe that's the connection, I don't know. But the only place you're actually going to find Christians choosing to handle poisonous snakes is here and there, in the odd place in the southern states. And I was actually reading a story that dated from 2012, and this guy, a preacher, was handling, I think, some kind of water moccasin, and it turned on him, bit him, and lo and behold, he died. You don't get many people trusting that, in fact, Mark 19:18 is original and that you should be drinking poison and handling snakes. So I would like to suggest that in truth, the Gospel of Mark ends at verse 8, which means we need to wrestle with some issues and say, okay, what does this actually mean for us and why did Mark do this? And there are a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, but some intriguing possible interpretations. The first is that there are some, well, inconsistencies. Maybe what is, just to describe, the women bring various ointments because they're going to anoint the body of Jesus, but they know there's a great big stone rolled in front of the tomb. And even as they're going, they actually are having a conversation and say, and who will roll a stone away for us? And they have no idea, so it seems at one level like a pointless journey. If you get to the Gospel of Matthew, he at least provides an earthquake and then brings in an angel to do the heavy lifting. And so that when the women arrive, the stone has in fact been rolled away, and there is an angel sitting on top of the stone, and lo and behold, the problem is solved. In Mark, the women arrive and the stone has been rolled, but no explanation why. they enter into the tomb and they see a young man dressed in white. And they're taken aback, like, who is this? You think perhaps Mark means this is an angel. And certainly when Matthew looked at Mark's story, he said, we better make him an angel and make it clear. And Luke said the same thing, only he said, actually, we need a couple of angels. But here in Mark, you have this young man, and he is actually going to talk to the women and explain things to them. The first thing he says is, do not be alarmed, which is a typical biblical phrase, the be not afraid, which occurs all over the scriptures. It's one of the things that I love about the scriptures, the number of times they say, if you're trusting in God and held in that love, then you don't have to be afraid. And I try to imagine what it would be like to live a life without fear. So I love that opening comment, be not afraid, do not be alarmed, says the young man dressed in white. And then goes on to specify, you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, trying to locate a real person in a real place. Goes on to say, who was crucified, meaning he really did actually die. What we're going to see happen here is not just a resuscitation, or that somehow Jesus was mistakenly entombed while he was in perhaps a deep coma and appeared to be dead. No, this was a guy absolutely dead and put in the tomb, and now, says the young man, he has been raised. And I'd like you to note the passive voice in the use of the verb, has been raised, which means that Jesus is a subject who has been acted upon, and you need an actor. The actor implicitly, fairly obviously, is God. And Mark is saying this is a big God event where God has done something miraculously impossible, crazy, exciting, thrilling. Jesus has been raised. In later Gospels and in later writings, you'll start to see it change so that Jesus becomes the subject, where Jesus says, I rose, or I will rise, or Jesus rose from the dead. But Mark is clear that we need to put the energy, the power, and the faith deeply into God. Okay, so there they are. And the angel says, now take a look around. He's not here, this Jesus of Nazareth, though he was crucified and dead and buried. And look at the grave clothing around. It's another bit of evidence. And so we have our first statement in the New Testament about an empty tomb. The tomb is empty. But before any further explanations, the angel immediately says, now go and tell the disciples that he is not here, and that in fact they are to go to Galilee where the risen Jesus will meet them. And it's fascinating to note that nearly all of the resurrection appearances in the New Testament have accompanying them a commandment to do something, a request that you get sent to either share good news, tell disciples, tell all the people in the world, to forgive people, to announce the coming of the kingdom, to announce that all are loved, and that we are to feed the sheep or feed the lambs. So it's not as if resurrection is primarily there for your own emotional fulfillment. It's in a way to give you energy and connection so that you can do something for God, that you will answer a call. And in this case, they are being told to go to the disciples, who now will go to Galilee. And it's absolutely fascinating that they are being asked to return where the whole ministry began. It's almost as if when you have a resurrection experience or an appearance of some sort, that you then have to look back at the beginning of your life or the whole journey of your life and reinterpret it in a new framework. Something incredible has happened which changes how you understand everything that preceded it. So they are being invited in a way to review their experiences of Jesus in Galilee in the light of the resurrection. And in fact, there are some scholars that say verse 8 of chapter 16 should be linked right back in to verse 1 of chapter 1, where Mark writes, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. And so in some ways, it looks as if verse 8 is a new beginning, that resurrection is not an end point, a fulfillment in and of itself, but is rather a statement that something new is beginning and that you are invited to participate in it. One of the things that I like is that Jesus also promises to go ahead and meet them in Galilee, which may be a statement about how our whole life unfolds. That is, you are sent for a task or you enter into your next day, and the promise is given to you that Jesus will already be there, or the love of God precedes and surrounds, and you will not be alone, but you will be met in whatever place you arrive. Okay, it finishes up, and you think, okay, the women have heard all of this. They're now going to be thrilled and excited and head off to do the work. And instead, the gospel's final words are, they were so filled with terror and amazement that they ran and told nobody. Now, it's interesting to look at the actual Greek that is used here. The word we'd use is terror. It comes from the Greek tromos, which you can almost understand as trauma, our English equivalent. And to say that the women were traumatized, and the word amazement is in Greek ekstasis, which we use as ecstasy, but when you go back to the original roots, it means ek, out, and stasis, out of stability, out of the norm, out of staying still, and what you expect. And so the women have experienced incredible trauma, and their lives have been upended, and they are out of their minds, out of themselves, and so they take off and say nothing, which is a very strange way to end a gospel. It sounds more like failure than some great success. And let me tell you, it's a difficult preach on Easter Sunday morning. You really have to work to figure out what is Mark trying to convey. So, for instance, you know that we try our best to follow the lectionary, which means that one year we're focused on the Gospel of Matthew, another year on the Gospel of Luke, and then a third year on the Gospel of Mark, and then you repeat. In the year that you're focusing on Mark, when the Easter story that you should be preaching on is chapter 16, verses 1 to 8, you're given the option of switching over and preaching John. And the story that is offered from the lectionary is Mary Magdalene going to the tomb and actually encountering Christ. And I lay bets that 90% of preachers on a Sunday morning of Easter will use the John story. When I look back over my collection of sermons or notes or outlines or what have you, only a couple of times have I actually decided to, okay, we're going to jump off the cliff and see if we can make sense out of preaching Mark 16, 1 to 8. It's much easier to do the garden and Mary. But this is a moment for us to think about those 8 verses and the story that Mark used and to say, does it make any sense? And first of all, I'd ask you really to try to identify with and imagine what the women themselves were feeling. I mean, can you imagine if there's something occurs to you that just throws everything upside down and is unexpected, and your life no longer makes sense according to the old formula, that in fact, something so strange means that nothing remains the same, and all you want to do is hide and pretend it's not really happening. In some crazy way, I think our pandemic right now is one of those kinds of moments in a negative way, that something is happening that is changing everything and turning life upside down, and you'd like to pretend that it isn't really happening, and you'd rather escape, and maybe we'll get back to normal. We're being told there is no going back to normal. Whatever finally emerges at the other end is the new normal. And most of us are a little bit anxious about that, not knowing what it is, but we know that it's going to have impact and actually make a huge difference. I think the women might have felt something similar. And so, being afraid, full of trauma and amazement, they took off and said, we won't say anything. Maybe I can share a story with you that has some parallel. It's something that I read and comes from the old days of Candid Camera. And I think some of us are of an age when you remember that program. You remember where they set up some kind of situation and some sucker would come by and be totally discombobulated, and all of us were watching and giggling, and he or she wouldn't know what was happening until suddenly, punchline, ho ho, you've been on Candid Camera. Well, the scene that I'm remembering involves a young man coming into a restaurant, sits down at the table, offers his order to the waitress, and is sitting there, maybe enjoying a drink. And on the table, there is a vase with 2 flowers that have run out of water. And so the flowers are just really near death and totally drooped over. And without doing anything, the young man is just sort of sitting there smiling. And then all of a sudden, the flowers start to, well, resurrect. They straighten up and all of a sudden you have these two flowers now standing up, and then they blossom, and the petals unfold, and you have two gorgeous flowers right in front of you. Well, the young man is totally flabbergasted, and starts to look around like, did anybody else see this? Or am I having a psychotic break, or is this an hallucination? And he's trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And then here's the sad part. His solution is to take his cutlery and his drink and move to another table and pretend that it just didn't happen. And that's the moment people come in and say, hey, 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 joke's on you. Welcome to Candid Camera. But I've never forgotten that moment when he would rather not believe what happened right in front of his eyes, something that was incredible and beautiful, because it contradicted everything that he knew could happen. And his solution was to remove himself from the situation. Maybe I'm making more of it than one might, but I still think that that is a dynamic in our human nature. Secondly, a number of people say, Mark almost wanted to say the women were afraid, and therefore, in fact, are dependent on you who are now hearing the gospel to do what they weren't able to do. That is, it functions in some way as an invitation to each one of us, we who hear and read this gospel at a later date, to step into the role that the women abandoned at that moment for good or understandable reasons, and to become ourselves speakers of the good news, to review our own life from the perspective of resurrection, and to be part of a whole movement. Okay, I have one more thing before we take a break and have a chance to have some discussion. If you're watching this from our YouTube channel, you may have taken several breaks because it's an awful lot of a talking head just going at you. But I do want to lift up some interesting interpretations that are offered by Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, and to some extent John Shelby Spong. Marcus and Dominique were members of the Jesus Seminar and tried to offer a new take on the life of Jesus and a new theological interpretation. And Borg in particular is somebody that has influenced some of my thinking. And he said, it may be that the empty tomb did not happen the way it has been described. That if you had been with the women on that Sunday morning with your smartphone and turned on a video camera, nothing would have shown up on the screen. It isn't, in fact, one of those factual, literal, historical events. What he wants to suggest is that Mark has created a parable, not a parable of Jesus was raised, but a parable of the empty tomb. Totally convinced that Jesus was raised, but it is not dependent on an empty tomb. And he says it has parabolic truth that is just as powerful and significant as if it were a literal event. He suggests, for instance, that when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, it wasn't a story that actually had to have happened. That is, that there was a Samaritan that helped out a man that had been beaten up and he took care of him. Whether or not that occurred literally did not impact the power of the story. Likewise, say the parable of the prodigal son. Was there a dad who took a runaway kid back into his loving arms and forgave him, and not only forgave him, but threw a great big party and celebrated? Maybe, but maybe not. It doesn't really depend on whether it literally occurred. What is important is the parabolic truth of that, which is to say there is a love that encompasses us, and this tells us the truth about how God is. Borg suggests that it was really in the time of the Enlightenment, the 17th century, that truth became synonymous with factuality. And in some ways, that's an incredible gift because it led to the scientific revolution and to the discovery of and the invention of just amazing things that have so enriched our lives. So it's not an either or. It is to suggest that things like symbol or metaphor or parable or myth are just a different way of trying to express truth. And you can have both of them operating at the same time, which is to say, in the larger picture, there is no contradiction between science and faith, that we need to figure out a way how the two come together. But in this situation here, Borg in particular says, let's not debate whether the empty tomb was real or not. Let's say, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But the primary question is, what does it mean? How does it speak to us? What is the truth? Whether it be rooted in factuality or whether it be rooted in parable. And I think there's some real wisdom in that, not getting caught up in the debates about was there an empty tomb, and if so, how did Jesus come out? And even the facetious questions of what was he wearing if he left all the grave clothes behind. I mean, you can take yourself down a rabbit warren, and rather you should step back and say, it is the meaning of it all that I think we need to look at. So at this moment, in the group, I want us to move into breakout groups, and I want there to be an opportunity for you to look at least a couple of questions. And the first of those questions would be to actually spend some time thinking about the state of mind of the women. Can you understand why they, and perhaps you, might have been terrified, might have run away, might have, almost said, I can't cope with this and I'd rather hide and be silent. So that would be one thing to look at. The second thing would be to say about for yourself, how important is the literal, factual, historical truth of there being an empty tomb? Can I sit easy with that as a maybe, maybe not, and rather work with the parabolic truth? And if so, then what does it mean? In the actual class, when we were at this moment, I had shared with people a long list of quotations about hope. I'm not going to read them out. It's too difficult when you don't have a piece of paper to follow. But there are one or two that I'd like to offer up that, in a sense, fit this understanding of parabolic truth. There is one written by Robert Fulghum. You'll know him as the Unitarian minister and the author of All I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And he writes, and I read, I believe that imagination is stronger than knowledge, that myth is more potent than history, that dreams are more powerful than facts, that hope always triumphs over experience, that laughter is the only cure for grief, and I believe that love is stronger than death. Now, you may want to debate that, but you can see Fulghum moving into that same stream of thought that says, let's think more than factuality. Let's think about imagination and myth and dreams and vision and parable and faith promises that come to our very heart. A second quotation, this comes from Alain de Botton, who is a Swiss-British philosopher. I don't know much about him, but I love this one line. He said, the difference between hope and despair is a different way of telling stories from the same facts. You have a set of facts, and how you choose to interpret them, how you create a story around those facts, is in fact what will lead to hope or despair. So think about the experience of the women, and then have some time to ponder by yourself or in conversation somewhere, how important is that empty tomb? And can you understand what it means parabolically? Maybe ask yourself, what does resurrection mean? So this is the point where normally we would have a break, and you'd have an opportunity to now talk with each other or go for a walk or think about what I've just said. But I'm going to, at this moment, continue on with this lecturette and move into part 2. So this is, for me, I think, a follow-up to that final question, saying, what does the resurrection mean? And over the centuries, various Christians and parts of the church have come with different answers that, in a sense, are distinct but primarily overlap and enrich each other. So I'm going to suggest there are 7 or 8 different answers to what does the resurrection mean. But you may end up, after hearing me, saying all of the above, or I don't actually see the distinction among some of them. They fit together like a hand in glove, only this time with 8 fingers instead of the 10. So maybe the very first thing to say about resurrection is that Jesus lives. Jesus is alive. Not in any way that you might say he's got flesh and blood and bones, but primarily he is a figure of the present, not simply of the past. And the presence that his followers felt in Jesus and knew before his resurrection, they continue to experience it after. And not just the experience, but in some ways there's a sense of divine empowerment or a movement of spirit power where you find yourself saying, well, he must be alive because I can feel him, I feel my life uplifted, my life is changed. So the first thing is to say, Jesus is still alive, or the presence of Jesus is still with us, enabling us to go forward. Secondly, and related to this, many people have said that resurrection is primarily God's yes. It is, in fact, a vindication that the way and the teaching and the actions of Jesus were in alignment with who and how God is. Because you see, if you looked at the story and had it end at crucifixion, you'd think to yourself, interesting guy, some interesting teachers, but look where it winds up. It winds up in defeat on the cross. And this interpretation of resurrection says, no, no, no. You need resurrection to say this is the vindication, and that the powers that crucified Jesus do not have the final or last word. Another way of saying that is that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. It looks as if Caesar has a big win. There he's dead. And what you hear in resurrection is, no, it's a penultimate kind of reality, and that there is a further statement that comes from God, and that God says yes to the way of Jesus, and that's worth staking and banking your life on. Okay, the third way of the meaning of resurrection is to extend that yes, and some people have said what it really represents is God's victory. Victory over the powers of domination and oppression, i.e. the Roman Empire. It would refer back to the escape and the liberation of the Jews from Egypt, when in fact the powers of Pharaoh were given a no. And it might speak in our own times whenever there is a political, social, or economic power that tries to claim highest loyalty, and we say no. In fact, we have a victory over that. Some people then even extended it further and said it is a victory over dark forces, dark powers, or the power of sin, and made it almost a cosmic battle. If you look in interfaith conversations, there are some faiths in the past that actually had two gods that were battling out, the good God, the bad God. You aligned yourself with the good God, and eventually there would be ultimate victory. That was, in fact, a key part of the Zoroastrian faith that the Jews came into contact with when they were in exile in Babylon. And in some ways, that understanding of what's happening in the world influenced some of their thinking. And so some were saying you can see a bit of it in this notion of God fighting powers of darkness. I find it interesting when we are in what you might call a spiritual but not religious age, when many people are not always drawn to the Christian story, we reinvent exactly the same struggle. Say in Star Wars, where you have the Force, and on the other side you have going to the dark side, and you have a Darth Vader, and then you have the Jedis like Yoda, the good Jedis, not the ones, and that human beings and people have to struggle. Are you going to be with the Force? Are you going over to the dark side? Or if you were to look at C.S. Lewis, more explicitly Christian, who's talking in the Chronicles of Narnia, you have the good side featured and symbolized in Aslan the lion, who is in full-on battle with the Witch of Winter, and the two go back and forth, challenging each other. You have a somewhat similar dynamic, say, in Lord of the Rings, where you have Sauron, who is the ruler of Mordor and is seeking the great ring of power and seeks to bring everybody into bondage and unto darkness. And you have, well, and here's it's less clear, there's not just a purely good side. Elves and wizards, Gandalf and some of the elf leaders are forces of light, but you also have the potential for them to be turned. And human beings are caught right again in the middle. Hobbits tend to be more resilient, but at the very beginning of the trilogy, you find hobbits, they too are a mixed bag. But it is this cosmic kind of struggle, and the conclusion here is that resurrection equals the moment of the big win. They take that now to what is really a fourth understanding, or the meaning of resurrection, and to say not only is it a win over the powers of domination, all the kings and Caesars, not only is it a victory over evil and cosmic powers, it is a victory over death. which is an immediate fear for all of us humans. We know we're going to die. We don't like to think about it. We do our very best to protect ourselves. See how we're operating in this pandemic when, in fact, the reality of our mortality is staring us right in the face. And so we're willing to do all kinds of social distancing and isolation, or sometimes not. But this great worry and concern is answered by resurrection. Some people say that the resurrection of Jesus is the gateway and the reassurance that each and every one of us will have life after death. They may not say what it looks like. It won't be necessarily angels on harps up on clouds, but that there is within this Jesus event the promise that each one of us, through the love and the action of God, not as a natural process, as in the springtime you get new life bursting up, but that in fact God acts so that we all continue on in some strange way, but are held in the memory or the love or the power of God. A variation of that is to say Jesus is the first fruits, the first to be resurrected, and while the rest of us may sleep or be dead, on the final days, at the moment of the second coming or the fulfillment of everything or the end times, all the dead shall be raised, and that we are therefore able to see in the resurrection of Jesus the promise that this movement has begun. The kingdom of God has broken in, and we are invited to be participants and to trust that if not now, certainly in time, somewhere down the road, we shall all be raised and we will shout hallelujah in one way or another. Okay, just a couple of more and then we're done. Patience for your listening to the talking head. But another way is to say that the body of Jesus is now the glorified body, and he becomes, in a sense, the universal and the cosmic Christ, that he is alive, has won this victory, but now is universal and is able to share power and to draw all of us in to one grand unity. And so that we can, in a sense, be aligned and be reshaped and reformed because of our connection with this resurrected Jesus. You remember how Paul says, when anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. That when we are part of this resurrected power, you might want to call it love, you might want to call it energy, you might want to say it is the power of the Spirit wearing the face of Jesus, embodying the teachings of Jesus, but it will touch us and draw us into a whole new way of living and feeling the oneness and the connection of it all, rather than our separate little egos that are terrified of death and determined to try to get ahead no matter who we have to step on. It's a whole different way. Okay, another meaning of the resurrection, I think there's real truth in this one, is that it gets linked back to crucifixion, and to say this is the pattern of our human living. That in fact there will inevitably be moments of challenge, of falling apart, of suffering, and eventually of death. But that we are falling apart and then being reborn and coming together once again. And that particularly a scholar like Richard Rohr will suggest that this is the pattern of our life. It is the pattern of the whole universe. So for instance, you will have a star explode, but that enables the dissemination of all kinds of elements throughout the universe that will now lead to the possibilities of life. Or you will have the world feeding a crisis and then falling apart, and something new will come from it. Again, people are hoping that the pandemic turns out to be one of those moments where indeed we are suffering and there is fear and anxiety and terrible tragedy for people, but out of that will come a new kind of world where there'll be less wealth inequity, where the poor will be cared for, where we will recognize the unity of the globe and work together. It may not happen, but the hope of the promise of resurrection is that's what we're working for. And finally, you didn't think you'd ever hear that word, but finally, we come to the meaning of resurrection as the promise of transformation. You can see how that's related to crucifixion and resurrection, but that transformation means that we, each of us as human beings, are on a journey of becoming, that we never reach a state of perfection, and that we are always a work in progress. Sometimes it's 2 steps backward for everyone forward, but that we have this possibility now to move into transformed life because a spiritual power has been released within us and around us that will enable that to occur. An early Greek theologian actually once wrote, I think it was Athanasius, who said, God became human so that human beings might become divine, which sounds a touch arrogant and never fully is achieved, but does point to a real hope of growing in spirit, growing in sanctification. That actually became a primary theology of the Eastern Church, what we now understand as the Christian Orthodox Church. The Western, primarily in those days Roman Catholic Church, said the primary human problem was sin and guilt, and that we needed to find some way of forgiveness, and therefore crucifixion resurrection became an atonement theory where we are saved from our sin by the blood of the Lamb. In the Eastern Church, they said, yeah, sin and guilt, but primarily death and transformation, and that we are going to understand resurrection as a moment that frees us into that power and that hope. Let me finish then by a quick review. So you have, and I'm going to ask you in a moment, either in a small group or with a friend, or even if you did some journaling yourself, what does the resurrection mean for you? Don't worry about 8 verses or the longer ending of Mark or the variety and the inconsistencies of the Gospels. What does it mean for you? Is it a proclamation that somehow the presence of Jesus and all that he represented is with you? Is it a vindication, God's yes? Is it some kind of victory over political social powers or over sin and dark powers or even over death? Is it an ultimate statement of grace and another statement that incarnation, this mixture of flesh and spirit, is in fact something special, and that you can go with that and say, I have hope? Is it a sense that you really do believe that crucifixion and resurrection go hand in glove? So even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you will not fear evil, for you know that God is with you and transforming you, and there will be transformation. Many of you know that in many of the talks that I give or sermons, I throw in a little bit of poetry, and I'm going to finish with just a few lines from Victorian poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. He was a Jesuit who struggled with his faith, struggled with depression, and he wrote a weird and wonderful poem. I'm not going to share the whole thing with you. It's called That Nature is a Heraclitean Fire and of the Comfort of the Resurrection. Only a Jesuit would come up with a name like that for a poem. But Heraclitus, the Heraclitean fire, he's the guy that said everything is in change, who's famous for having coined the phrase, you can't step into the same river twice. And Hopkins began to feel that that was actually depressing, saying everything you do and everyone you love is all going to fall apart, nothing stands firm, all you see is the decay of time. And then he gets right near to the end of the poem, and then he says, enough of all that gloom and doom and what have you. But he says, the resurrection, a heart's clarion, grief's gasping, away, joyless days, dejection. Across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. Flesh, fade, and mortal trash fall to the residuary worm. World's wildfire leave but ash. In a flash, at a trumpet crash. And this is what I love. I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. Can you get that? I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And this Jack, joke, poor, potsherd, patch, matchwood, immortal diamond is immortal diamond. Resurrection is a promise that you and I and everyone you meet, we are immortal diamond at our very best, at our very core. And this is God's love, dream, and desire, and it is what God is working for. And the resurrection releases the power for that to happen. That coal, carbon, crushed, changed, and this poor Jack, joke, potsherd, matchwood is immortal diamond, and so are you. So take some time, talk, ponder, journal. What does the resurrection mean to you? Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.